The air was thick with tension as Officer Gregson stood in the parking lot, his breath quickened by the chase. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the concrete, the rhythm of his heart syncing with the rapid beats of his boots. He gripped his radio tightly, his knuckles white with determination. "I've got him!" "Suspect matches the description perfectly," he barked into the device, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise. Confidence dripped from every syllable. He glanced at the man he'd detained, a towering figure in a tailored navy blue suit, a briefcase in his hand. There was no sign of struggle, no resistance, but Gregson tightened his hold on the man's arm anyway. The suspect stood there, unruffled, his eyes calm, unwavering. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low but firm, the words settling like a challenge in the air. Gregson scoffed, casting a glance at his partner, who stood nearby with a raised brow. "Yeah, well, that's not for you to decide. We'll let the court sort it out," he retorted, his tone dripping with a smug certainty. "The charge? A string of petty thefts in the downtown area. The description? Tall, black male, in his 40s. That was all Gregson needed to seal his judgment. The man's polished appearance, his dignified demeanor, none of that registered. In Gregson's mind, he was just another criminal trying to play innocent. The walk to the courthouse felt like an eternity. Gregson's hand remained on his holster, his fingers twitching as if expecting the man to make a break for it. But the suspect didn't flinch. He carried himself with quiet assurance, his gaze scanning the busy streets ahead, never betraying fear, never showing a flicker of anger. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. People shuffled to their seats, whispering among themselves. The officer led the man toward the bench, and the room buzzed with quiet murmurs. "Looks like he's caught another one," someone whispered, but the accused remained composed, his eyes steady. He leaned in toward Gregson as they approached the judge. "You're going to regret this," he murmured, almost inaudibly, but the words hung in the air, a challenge that no one could ignore. Gregson smirked, barely containing his satisfaction. "We'll see about that." But as the man prepared to speak, there was something about the way he carried himself, his unshakable confidence, his piercing gaze, that hinted this was no ordinary case. The courtroom hummed with quiet chatter as Gregson stood tall, his chest puffed out, his expression smug, as though he had just delivered the catch of the year. Meanwhile, the accused stood silently, his briefcase still in hand. His polished shoes caught the harsh fluorescent light, reflecting it back with a sharp gleam. The judge, an older man with a weary face, shuffled through some papers before glancing up at Gregson. "Officer, please present your case." Gregson cleared his throat, his voice filled with self-assurance as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, this man matches the description provided by several witnesses in a series of thefts reported downtown last week. Tall black male, early 40s, fits into AT." His words were steeped in certainty, but there was a tinge of desperation to them, as if he were trying too hard to convince the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking from Gregson to the accused. "Sir, would you care to state your name for the record?" The man set his briefcase down with measured grace, adjusting his tie as if preparing to address the court with something more important than just his name. "My name is Malcolm Avery. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The room fell deathly silent. The weight of his words hung heavy, pressing down on everyone present. Gregson's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he quickly masked it. "Your Honor, I don't see how his profession is relevant to the charges." Malcolm's gaze shifted toward Gregson, sharp and unyielding. "It's relevant because it underscores the recklessness of this officer's actions. He detained me without cause, based on a vague description and nothing more." His voice was calm, but each word carried the force of a sledgehammer. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Malcolm's words weren't loud, but they commanded attention. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he watched the drama unfold. For Gregson, this wasn't going according to plan. He had expected another routine booking, a case that would slip through the system unnoticed, just like all the others. But standing before him was a man who didn't just know the law, he embodied it. Gregson's confidence wavered, but he wasn't ready to back down. He shifted on his feet, trying to steady himself, refusing to admit he might have made a mistake. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the murmurs in the courtroom to subside. His gaze moved back and forth between Malcolm Avery and Officer Gregson, brow furrowing in thought. "Mr. Avery," he began carefully, "are you suggesting that this arrest was baseless?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. Your Honor, baseless is an understatement. I was stopped while leaving my office for lunch, carrying nothing but this briefcase. He tapped it lightly for emphasis. I asked Officer Gregson why he was detaining me, and his only justification was that I matched the description. No evidence. No probable cause. Just an assumption. Gregson, now shifting uncomfortably on his feet, jumped in. Your Honor, the description came from multiple witnesses. It's not about assumptions. It's about following leads. Malcolm turned fully toward Gregson, his expression cool but piercing. Following leads? You mean relying on stereotypes? Did you even bother to ask for more details, or did you just stop the first black man you saw in a suit? A ripple of gasps spread through the room. Gregson's jaw tightened, his face flushing with embarrassment. That's not fair, he stammered. Fair? Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. Do you know how many times men who look like me are stopped, questioned, or arrested for no reason other than fitting the description? I've spent my career fighting for justice, officer. And what you did today is the exact opposite of that. The judge raised a hand, silencing the escalating tension. Gentlemen, that's enough, he said firmly, though his voice betrayed a flicker of intrigue. He turned back to Malcolm. Mr. Avery, I will give you the opportunity to continue, but be concise. Malcolm nodded, stepping forward, his presence commanding the room's focus. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady and full of gravitas, this incident is more than just a case of mistaken identity. It's a window into the systemic issues that plague our legal system. When assumptions replace evidence, when bias overrides judgment, innocent people suffer. A hush fell over the room. Even those who had dismissed the case as routine were now sitting on the edge of their seats. Gregson's confidence, once so sure, was visibly crumbling. His earlier bravado had been reduced to a defensive posture, his shoulders hunched as though trying to shield himself from Malcolm's words. Malcolm wasn't done yet. His next words would make the judge reconsider everything he had ever taken for granted. Adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness, Malcolm took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom. He turned back to Gregson, locking eyes with him. Officer, you said the description came from multiple witnesses. Can you share with the court exactly what those witnesses reported? Gregson hesitated, glancing down at his notes, his voice quieter now. Tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark jacket, he muttered. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, a faint smile curling his lips. That's it? Nothing about distinguishing features, behavior, or even specific clothing. Just a vague description that could apply to hundreds of men in this city? Gregson's silence spoke volumes, and the room seemed to shrink, the tension thickening with every passing second. Malcolm addressed the judge again. Your Honor, this is the problem. Vague descriptions lead to vague policing. Instead of investigating, officers make snap decisions that disproportionately harm black men. The judge, his expression stoic, tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the bench. Mr. Avery, are you implying that this is a broader issue and not just an isolated incident? Malcolm didn't hesitate. I'm not implying it, Your Honor. I'm stating it. He turned to the courtroom, addressing everyone now. I've seen this pattern time and again. Young men detained for standing on the wrong corner. Fathers handcuffed in front of their children because someone thought they looked suspicious. How many of those cases make it to court? How many lives are disrupted or destroyed because of careless assumptions? Gregson shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence replaced by an uneasy tension. Malcolm wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the very foundation of Gregson's actions. Officer Gregson, Malcolm said, turning back to him, did you know I was a federal prosecutor when you stopped me? Gregson's face flushed. No, I didn't exactly. Malcolm's voice was a smooth, razor-sharp whisper, slicing through the heavy air in the courtroom. Because you didn't ask, he said, his words steady yet cutting. You didn't check. You didn't verify your claims. You acted on instinct, and that instinct wasn't about justice. It was about bias. The room fell dead silent, save for the faint rustle of someone shifting in the gallery, their unease palpable. Malcolm let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, before he addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, I am not seeking to punish this officer, he continued, his tone deliberate, eyes never leaving the judge's. I'm seeking accountability. Because if this can happen to me, if it can happen to a federal prosecutor, it can happen to anyone. The judge leaned forward, his gaze intense, clearly weighing his next words. The tension in the room thickened, the atmosphere charged. It was clear this moment would not end quietly. The judge finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze now fixated on Officer Gregson. "Officer," he began, his voice firm but measured, "do you have anything further to say in your defense?" Gregson swallowed hard, his face flushed, his once confident posture crumbling. The swagger that had carried him into the courtroom was gone, replaced with a disquieted man struggling to hold onto his authority. "Your Honor, I was just following procedure. I didn't mean for..." His voice faltered, barely above a whisper. Before he could finish, Malcolm cut in, his voice sharp and commanding. "If this is what you call procedure, it's time we question the very procedures you claim to follow." The judge raised a hand, signaling for Malcolm to pause. "Mr. Avery, let him finish." Gregson glanced nervously between the judge and Malcolm, his voice now weak. "I thought I was doing my job. I didn't mean to target anyone unfairly." Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression softening only for a moment. His voice, however, remained unwavering, slicing through the air with precision. "That's the thing, Officer Gregson. Bias doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as instinct, as just doing your job. But the consequences are real. And they're devastating." The courtroom was still. Every word Malcolm spoke carried the weight of years of frustration and experience. He turned to the gallery, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "I've spent my career fighting for a system that works for everyone, not just for those who look a certain way or live in certain neighborhoods. But no system can fix what we won't acknowledge." The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Avery, you've made your point. What would you suggest as a resolution to this matter?" Malcolm paused for just a moment, gathering his thoughts as he carefully chose his next words. "Your Honor, I don't believe in vengeance, but I do believe in accountability. This officer needs to understand the harm his actions caused, not just to me, but to the integrity of the system he represents." Gregson's face reddened, but he remained silent. His hands trembled slightly, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, his tone resolute. "Let this be a turning point," Malcolm said, his words like a challenge. "Not just for Officer Gregson, but for everyone in this courtroom. If we don't confront the biases we carry, they will continue to poison the very foundation of justice." As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, a subtle shift in the room's tension signaled that something significant was about to unfold, something that would not be easily forgotten. The judge let out a slow breath, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on both Malcolm and Gregson, and then on the crowd. "This case," he began, his voice steady but reflective, "is not just about a wrongful arrest. It's about the principles we are supposed to uphold, in this courtroom and in our society." His gaze moved to Gregson, who was now staring at the floor, avoiding eye contact. "Officer Gregson, your actions today demonstrate a troubling lack of judgment. While you may have believed you were acting in accordance with the law, your failure to gather sufficient evidence and your reliance on an incomplete description show a disregard for due process." Gregson nodded slightly, his lips pressed tight, but he remained silent. The judge turned his focus to Malcolm. "Mr. Avery, your composure and ability to articulate the deeper issues at hand are commendable. However, I am not blind to the anger and frustration that situations like this can cause. You've turned what could have been a moment of personal indignation into an opportunity for collective reflection." Malcolm inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgement of the judge's recognition, though his gaze remained unwavering. The judge leaned forward, his focus now solely on Officer Gregson. "I am ordering you to attend mandatory training on implicit bias and community engagement, in addition to issuing a formal written apology to Mr. Avery. Furthermore, I am requesting that the police department review its protocols for detaining suspects based solely on vague descriptions." A ripple passed through the courtroom. A few people exchanged glances, while others nodded silently as though the ruling reflected something long overdue. Gregson's gaze finally met Malcolm's. There was no bravado, no defiance, only regret. His voice was quiet, but the sincerity was undeniable. I'm sorry." Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He studied Gregson for a moment, then gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "I hope this is a lesson that leads to change, officer. For you, and for the system you serve. As the courtroom began to clear, Malcolm remained standing, his presence commanding, even in the now emptying room. A reporter approached, microphone in hand, ready for the next soundbite. "Mr. Avery," the reporter asked, "do you have anything to say about today's outcome?" Malcolm looked directly into the camera, his voice steady and clear, as though delivering a message that transcended the moment. Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey. And that journey requires all of us to challenge the systems and biases that hold us back. We can't afford to look away. We must be better. The reporter lowered the microphone, and Malcolm turned to leave. His briefcase in hand, he stepped outside into the sunlight that bathed the courthouse steps. The weight of the day's events was heavy, but not overwhelming. This was just a small step, he knew, one in a much larger journey. As Malcolm walked down the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered outside. Some nodded in silent respect, others whispered about what they had just witnessed. Malcolm paused for a moment, surveying the city streets. The chaos of the world continued, moving on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But Malcolm knew better. Change, real change, began with moments like these. It wasn't about grand speeches or sweeping reforms. It was about holding people accountable. Forcing systems to confront their flaws. One case at a time. Today was a victory. But it was only the beginning of a much longer road. Turning to the camera crews on the courthouse lawn, he addressed not just them, but anyone who might hear his words. Accountability isn't just about one officer, one courtroom, or one case. It's about all of us asking the hard questions, refusing to settle for excuses, and demanding better for everyone. His voice carried a quiet strength, one that would resonate long after the moment had passed. And with that, he walked away, the weight of his briefcase light compared to the significance of the moment he had just created.